phone are made out of lithium-ion batteries that are obviously made out of what? Lithium. That is found primarily in Africa. They are also needed for a lot of big things like greener tech, like for making solar panels, etc., etc. They are equally needed to make things like cars. I think you get the point. This means that there is a very high demand for these resources and there's an equally high supply. What then is the issue? As we have already explained, a world without the cartel is largely fragmented and divided and is susceptible to foreign exploitation of that competition that is existent in that regard. What then are the impacts? One, with the existence of the cartel, it leads to better deals for these African states because foreign actors need these resources and cannot constantly pit the African states against each other for their own benefits. But secondly, you prevent these insofar as we have explained that these foreign actors exercise a lot of influence or control over the pricing of these resources. What that means is that they have a lot of influence with regards to key infrastructural resources that are important to the economy of these states. What this translates to is things like lobbying power or their ability to share in the monopoly of force in these states and exercise undue influence with regards to things like laws and regulations that are existent in these states. Comparatively, because of the coordinated efforts, that fragmentation cannot be exploited in that particular regard. That brings leads a lot of things like undue state influence and state capture, etc., etc. Panel, it's a very simple debate. The side that wins is the side that shows how the use of these resources inure the best to these African states and how that is something that is inherently justified and legitimate. Proudly, Prime Minister.
Are you ready? I'm going to begin my speech in 3. Oh, okay, wait, just give me a second. Okay, I'm ready. I'm going to begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. The discovery that hurts Africans, and South Africans in particular the most, wasn't minerals, but was that of a system of capital, which led to a cohesive mobilization of labor within that nation that had never been seen before until they required that system of capital to extract. The problem with government side of this debate is that they essentialize that system and make minerals a particular necessity for states across the continent. The important contribution from opening opposition in that regard is that we're going to show you contextually why this is harmful, but secondly that we're going to show you in principle why this is particularly bad for Africans in general, but thirdly we're going to show you in practice why nothing which they claim is going to come about. But before that, I'm going to do a little bit of rebuttal. First, they tell us that the Dutch curse is a problem and that we shouldn't be just exporting raw minerals and that, yeah, that's what's going to happen. Literally, that is their policy, right? Their policy is create a collective bargaining power of exporting raw minerals and using that to control their prices. That doesn't mean you're not going to export them. But then they say that the reason why their side is better is because you control prices. Recognize that by their very mechanism, it's a monopoly. How do you conserve a monopoly? 2 things. You control supply, you raise prices. When we raise prices, the reason you do this is in order for you to maintain bargaining power on those minerals and to maintain that monopoly so that nobody else can buy into that market and get your capital. The reason this is fundamentally important is because all of the benefits they talk about of African states accessing all of these resources don't necessarily exist because they're raising prices to keep other people out of competition, but also because they can get greater capital from their Western counterparts. If you think that this is problematic and you think this isn't true, just think about OPEC, right? I don't know if you guys have seen what OPEC nations look like, but the vast majority of the OPEC cartel, which is the oil cartel in the Middle East, Most of those countries don't have equality. Most of those countries have the worst labor conditions. Most of those countries are not trading with one another. They're still selling their oil to the West and selling their souls to the West. And the reason for this is because of the mechanisms of monopoly which you essentialize into those economies. The third and most important response they're not taken is they talk about fragmentation and division and exploitation. I'm going to show you why exploitation on their side is far worse. But secondly, I'm going to show you why they essentialize the system of capital that I spoke about. But first, a little bit of contextualization. What did I mean by the minerals revolution when I started the speech? In South Africa, when the minerals revolution started, we didn't have any incentive for people across the country to start engaging in mining, right? There were differences in the racial order in the nation. People in Cape Town had different racial rules to people in Johannesburg. People had different labor rules in Cape Town to people in Johannesburg. But the discovery of minerals, and specifically the necessity to use minerals in order to drive the economy and gain soft power on the global stage, meant we need a cohesive mechanism of capital in order for us to utilize a great amount of labor. Recognize that their policy is literally expanding that localized metric to the whole of the continent. That means that you're then necessitating the need for minerals to have bargaining power. And that brings me on to my first argument, which is about how you make minerals a necessary condition for development. Recognize that their side of the house, the only reason why you get any more soft or bargaining power with the West in any regard is because of these minerals. That means they become the most sacrosanct facet of your economy. But secondly, that you need to drive their growth further and further and further in order for you to actually gain the benefits of them. But thirdly, that you need to control supply. That doesn't mean decreasing supply. You need to increase supply as much as possible so you can cater to demand when needed and maintain that monopoly and maintain that soft power. Why is this fundamentally important? It's important because it has three structural harms that are bad for Africans. Number one, it makes that industry integral to all of these African nations. In the instance where raw materials, or those particular raw materials, start to become less valuable, like is being done with oil, recognize that 95% of new energy production in the world has literally been solar energy, right? As literally raw minerals become less and less relevant as time goes on, your whole economy is literally contingent on that. That's a harm in the long term. Secondly, and importantly, you create oppressive conditions of capital because, like I said, you have to create a cohesive machine to extract and continue to supply the monopoly and profit maximize. Importantly, the incentive structure then is literally inequality. You're literally driving investment in all of these countries through your minerals revolution, and you literally need labor. Recognize mining is one of the most labor-intensive industries that we have. That means you need Africans to continue to go into those mines. But importantly, that you need those conditions to be as harsh as possible in order to profit maximize as much as possible to maintain monopoly that they need to get soft power, not take it. But thirdly and importantly, what does this mean? It means you entrench inequality that has been within these countries for years and years and years. But the most important reason why that is so bad is not only because of the practical harms, which I've already spoken about, but because historically this spits in the faces of the necessity to overthrow our colonial overlords, because we sell our souls not to raw materials but to them in the long run by monopolizing our states and internalizing the need for capital. The third harm is going to be why collaboration on mining is something that, is on the alternative. But before that, I'll take a point of information for closing. Nothing? Okay. Oh, yeah.
Why is it that it is the only form of development and other forms of development cannot exist in and of itself?
I think that's a sensible point. Our claim for being opposition is reasonable. We're not saying that this is the only industry that we're going to have, but we're saying that that's going to be the vast majority of your priority. That is, most of your soft power is based on this. That is, most of your industry is based on this. Our claim is very sensible, and that's what my alternative is dealing with. On our side, we concede and we agree that people are still mining, that some conditions are still bad, that PMCs and things are involved in different countries and forcing for mining like the Wagner Group, like they say. But the problem is that on their side, they increase the scale of this oppression across the continent and they essentialize it as a means of development and the only way in which they can get soft power. That's not to say that we don't have mining and exploitative conditions, but it's to say that the scale is different. In South Africa, we have labor unions that protect people's rights. In many nations, we have ways and innovation of protecting individuals and Africans on the ground. On our side, we do that. But thirdly, that in terms of pragmatic benefits, because we essentialize it less, we can use those raw materials to do what opening government says is something valuable. We use the bits of that we aren't exporting to grow our own local industries, to grow the secondary things which they want, the final products which they want. You don't grow that by monopolizing and utilizing the need and demand for your resources by increasing supply and raising prices. The only team that can relevantly win is a team that understands minerals and the system of capital that will impress and profit maximization that is the government bench.
Leader of opposition for the speech now from the dirty primers.
Okay, right.
Okay, I'm starting. Panel, it is important for us to notice that in every state, they have an added advantage. What does this mean? Meaning every state has a particular resources that benefits them or is unique to them. So for example, Ghana has cocoa because we produce cocoa in excess, or our land is viable to grow cocoa. Therefore, that is our added advantage. We have gold, that is our added advantage. For countries like Sudan, Niger, Congo, their added advantage is critical minerals like lithium, critical minerals like cobalt. The question then is, in a world where your economy depends on these resources, which side is better for a state in trading? Because notice, in both worlds, this state would trade because Niger needs to trade its lithium in order to boost its economy. Sudan would have to trade its cobalt in order to boost its economy. Even if they don't want to trade, because these critical resources are so important, Silicon Valley companies would come to these states and will want to mine them. Notice these are things that are happening in Congo. They are abusing children to mine these resources because Apple needs this cobalt. Green transitioning tech companies need these resources. Our solution is this. We think that African states should come together and create this cartel in order to improve their bargaining power, right? And I'll be arguing to you some of the benefits. So right now, moving on to rebuttals. We think that OO is out of this debate because they assume that this is a policy that a government is taking, like this is the sole policy that African states are taking. Panel, notice that this policy or this action can be taken together with other things. So for example, if Sudan is part of this cartel, it doesn't mean that Sudan is not taking care of its agriculture, because if it has a land that is viable for growing crops, they will still have to develop that resource. They argue as if this is an action where all of a sudden all African states would now want to develop resource. Also, they can't fear that all African states have lithium, cobalt, etc. This means that they need to self-preserve, they need to survive. This means that they will have to grow or develop the other economies that they have or other industries that they have in order to develop the economy. They don't stand a chance in this debate. Their second argument is on bad labor laws or entrenching inequalities. Notice that they don't tell us how they solve the inequalities that Nana says proves to you in this debate, and also argues to you how in the status quo states are being exploited. Why is this true? Because they are not collectivized. They can go to one state and bargain for cheaper rates, and also move to other African states and bargain for lower rates. Because of this, African states will have to also lower their rates or their trade metrics in order to compete. Because notice, these states have similar things, right? So now it becomes who has like a better advantage to the west or to the east. We think that when African states with these resources collectivize, this means that they trade as a bloc with the east or the west. This increases their bargaining power, and I'll be emphasizing that in my next. Before I move on, see.
So the countries you want to start buying these resources at a high cost currently benefit from the blood money that's happening in Sudan, for example. Why would they suddenly choose civilized methods of negotiation?
Yeah, exactly. That is why this house believes that we are saying that it is better for them to be part of the cartel alliance. So, like, I'll be responding to that. One, economic benefit. We think that African states, as individual states, do not have the bargaining power to negotiate better terms for themselves. How? These resources are mostly underdeveloped or do not have the added value, because the only way cobalt becomes very important is when Silicon Valley companies use them and they become beneficial. Often, some of these leaders of African states are corrupt and have personal incentive and will work for their benefits. This means that even if they have the power to negotiate for better trading deals for lithium in Niger or ETC, they are less likely to negotiate for better terms for their country. They are more likely to get some money for themselves, so that they don't charge these Western companies or Eastern companies more because they want the profits for themselves, right? So what does this mean, right? We know that this collective bargaining cartel ensures that African states get more work for their resources, because when negotiations happen, they affect all other states. So for example, in their world, Niger alone cannot stand against China, Niger alone cannot stand against Russia, but when Niger is part of the cartel alliance, Niger, Sudan, and all other states that have this critical minerals can say that if you don't give us 85% for our resources, we are not going to trade with you, we are going to trade with the East, or we are going to trade with other states. This means that they have this bargaining power, unlike their world, where if, say, Niger is saying that if we don't want to give you our lithium for 85%, they can move to Sudan and say that, and Sudan will be more likely to trade at a lower rate. We think that in our world, when they collectivize, they are able to speak as one voice, they are able to empower their voice, and they are also able to have better negotiation deals. What is even better in our world is that when these negotiations happen, it has a rippling effect on all other states. This means that other small states that couldn't have negotiated on their own would also benefit from it, because now they have similar laws that govern the exploitation of their resources in ECC, right? What then are the impacts of my case? One, on African states. Within one, more money means that they generate more money for critical resources that exist. Second, more revenue means that they have enough money to solve economic, social, and political issues, because most of Africa's problem is based on the lack of funds or revenue, because the IMF all the time, because we're not able to utilize our resources that we have. In our world, at least we mitigate the harm that exists, the fact that Africans are not able to generate revenue for themselves. What then is the impact of this on Africans? When we have better value for our resources, this contributes to GDP. So for example, most states' GDP is hinged on their resources or the things that they produce, how they export and import into their country. In a world where they are able to trade with better deals, it directly translates into better GDP. Better GDP means that there is what are the sub impacts? Better living conditions, because when the economy has a better GDP, means that there is a trickling effect of having better living conditions, means that more money for people in their pockets. Also, we think that in any case, we'll be able to sustain this monopoly because of the green transition. Notice that in the status quo, every state agrees that there is a climate problem and we need to transition. These critical minerals are very important in creating green technology. So no side can fear that, we cannot sustain this monopoly. It's supposed to be able to prove to you that African states are the only states that have these critical minerals, and if they are able to collectivize, they will be able to sustain this monopoly, and they'll be able to fight against Western and Eastern powers that have been exploiting them over and over again. Proudly, OG.
We thank the Deputy Prime Minister for that speech. We now call on the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Is everyone ready?
Yeah.
Cool. That is okay. Then I'm gonna start in 3, 2, 1. The most important thing that we need to know in this debate is that fundamentally it is about how we bargain and how we're using the minerals. Yeah. The argumentation that we're getting from the government bench to start us off with of it being a singular policy is emotionally inaccurate because we are not saying that you're basing your entire economy around one singular thing. We're saying there is a fundamental aspect of almost all African economies, which is the exploitation of natural resources that you are then going to either lose or is going to become unsustainable. We don't care if you're able to develop other things that is outside the scope of the motion, because what we're talking about is this. And when this collapses, that it's still going to be bad, no matter how many other things you have in place. And the vast majority of the nations don't even have that in place anyway, because the majority of African nations have minerals as their biggest export, right? Cool. The next thing that we then get in responsive work from their OG team is this idea of sustainability. You fundamentally misunderstand Cheyenne if you're saying that people are always going to need them. People may always need natural resources. Natural resources will not always be there for you to need. They're also becoming infinitely harder to actually be able to mine. It looks like things like mines that are 50, 20 years old are much harder than mines that we started today, because the longer you mine, the deeper you go, the less it is, the harder it is to find, the more that you've exhausted that, which means you need more labor, you need more people, and you usually need more exploitative conditions to be able to maintain the same degree of output. You're probably going to need the same degree of output when you've agreed into a contract of collective bargaining and you said this is what you're going to do, right? That is why it is dangerous in the very first place. The next thing that they then tell us is that you can't fight alone. The very burden of this motion is to tell you why they think collective bargaining as a cartel is the best alternative. Cheyenne brings you up the alternative that individuals can exist within their own capacity. States, by individuals, by the way, can exist within their own national capacity, right? He explains this very well, that it's not the only alternative. There are multiple other alternatives. There are things like being able to have set prices through the AU. We need to understand why specifically cartels are the most important thing within this debate, because you can equally still have set prices without trading off sovereignty, without being able to trade off your own control in the very first place, and being able to sign binding contracts that are saying this is what you need to do, and this is something that you're now hinging with all of us. Cool. Then let's get into a little bit of direct responses. The first thing that they tell us is that it's going to, for the most part, help with personal corruption, because personal corruption within the states are going to be incredibly bad, and that's going to reduce it because we're working together. Unlikely to be true. You're more likely going to be able to get more scapegoating in that instance, because they're able to blame other people outside of that, and you're not directly able to hold the cartel accountable because they are not your own government. You can hold your own government accountable for corruption and for squirreling funds. You cannot hold 15 states accountable unless you're able to get all of those states working together. It is incredibly hard to be able to get this in the very first place. You're more likely going to have corruption on their side of the debate. The next thing that we then get from them is the idea that you're able to rebuy these minerals, right? And that's where the vast majority of this economy and all of these things are coming from. You're more likely being able to be unable to do that on their side of the motion. Why? Because when you're doing collective cartel bargaining, it means you're selling pretty much everything that you have, and it means you don't have explicit control over the minerals in your country. If you do not have explicit control over the minerals in your country, it means you're going to have to sell them all. It means you're unable to be able to produce and keep doing things within your own economy and be able to use those mineral resources when and if you have the ability in the first place. Cool. The next thing that they tell us is about Western attacks. Pay attention here because it's integrated into my main matter, right? The important part here is that there are more than the West that attack African nations for their minerals. Rwanda is currently attacking the DRC for their minerals, right? This is not something exclusive to the West. It is as illegitimate to say that we're now giving Rwanda equal control over the Congo's minerals as it is to say that we're giving the West equal control over African minerals, because they're falling under the exact same principles of people who are trying to actively colonize you and trying to actively take away the resources in your first place. And so that is a circular reason in the first place, but we don't want to legitimize having any other nation having that principle buy-in into your own minerals, especially nations that have historically tried to subjugate you and tried to take those very same minerals in the first place. Next thing they talk about is incentive. Very weird, because they tell us about how we want to go against influence. You're still going to have influence because you're likely going to trade one monopoly for another, right? In fact, you're going to trade it for a worse monopoly, because rather than catering to the West, you now have to do everything within the African states. You yourself as a government and as a nation have no fundamental control unless you're one of like the big 3 or 5 nations that are able to have the most control within African states, right? And so it's incredibly unlikely that the vast majority of these nations are going to be benefiting. They're going to be equally, if not more, exploited because they're not given the ability to control their own like resources. Cool. The idea of better deals again falls into the idea that you never specifically tell us why we need cartels. Cheyenne tells you why personal bargaining is far better. I tell you why things like set sale prices through the AU are things that are far better to do in the first place. Cool. Let's get on to main matter. I've touched this already a little bit, but the principle of ownership and the principle of sovereignty, you do not want nations that have historically tried to harm you and tried to take over your resources to want to take that. These include African nations, and that is something that we principally can never support, regardless of the other benefits that it gives us. Even if they are not a state that has tried to have their resources taken by other African nations, they are states that have had their resources tried to take by other places through things like colonialism, through things like pacts that they themselves are then reduced in the amount of control they have over their own economy and their own like functioning resources, right? This is something we can never support because we want African nations to have sovereignty and to never fall into these same traps again. The last thing I have then to tell you is about destabilization. We think that when you have a monopoly, it's far easier to be able to destabilize an economy or destabilize a union because there's one specific branch you need to destabilize, right? And these are branches that already fight with each other. We don't see cohesion within the AU, within the African nations in totality. We equally see the West coming in to intervene. It's insane to say that they would stop intervening simply because, like, we've now formed a union, right? What do we win this debate on? Vulnerability of being able to protect the citizens, their countries, and their interests, the principles of ownership, sovereignty, and the long-term growth that Cheyenne has told you about in his speech. There's no team but OO that could win.
We thank the Deputy Leader for that speech, and that brings us close to the opening half of this debate. Now I'd like to call upon a member of Government to express their views. Take that.
Right, cool. Name Nathaniel. Here. Cool. Starting my speech. 3, 2, 1. The reason why, despite having so many countries that have found their sovereignty or freedom from their colonizers, but they are still very much underdeveloped and have not necessarily undergone thorough industrialization that allows them to be able to compete with other nations, simply because existing states have been pulling against each other rather than necessarily coming together necessarily collectively. CO already gives us this whole idea of saying the incentive is not necessarily there, that these individual states are already benefiting from that particular thing. Note, they avoid what status quo necessarily look like. We think the specific reason why there is a trend of military coups and nationalization of resources that are necessarily happening within our Western nation, specifically because they understood that economy is uniquely tied to the idea of liberation and sovereignty and all of those things. And because of that particular thing, it makes quite amount of sense to buy into the idea of actually collectively coming together and having a collective understanding as to how do we deal with those particular resources. We think in terms of justification of monopoly, we think it makes quite sense. The justification is there. The resources of African states for the vast majority of time have consistently not been used to benefit the individuals of African states. When they say this particular thing is not sustainable, they give you 2 reasons, and we'll show you why they are false. Right? One, they say these resources eventually are going to like not be available or hard to mine. We say for those duration where they're necessarily available, we'd prefer that they are being used for the benefit of African states. We are fine. For far too long, they have been used to benefit individuals outside of those, right? Secondly, is like this whole ridiculous idea. They say the world is progressing towards greener methods in terms of they neglect how capitalism necessarily operates and how it works. Proficiency and efficiency is something that necessarily matters. Why is this important? Note this, using a solar and investing into lithium batteries, what is more efficient? The usage of lithium and all of those. That means in terms of demand of this particular critical resources, the demand will always necessarily be there. So they also fail on that particular thing. Before I get into my substantive, cool.
Panel, I just want to clarify, right? Because there's a huge straw man going on Gov Bench. To say that we're saying that, oh, this is suddenly just going to be reliant on these minerals for no reason. When minerals become your main source of bargaining power, how valuable do they become?
Sure, this is another problem on their side, because what do African states necessarily have to offer if not minerals and labor? How are they necessarily going to be able to become make their states necessarily be better? Because even when you look at the riches of those Western countries, it started with what? The trade of slaves, that is the labor from African states. Secondly, the plundering of taking off the resources of Africa. Inherently, those are the things that we have a sort of bargaining power to necessarily depend on. So we need to be able to use them to our benefit. If monopoly is such a bad thing, for the limited time that it benefits us, is like the thing that we say we are quite fine with it. Look at why from a principle level this particular thing is important, especially in terms of justification, right? There's a specific reason why in terms of social policies, the ones that are in a better position to be able to take care of vulnerable individuals happen from position of privilege. That is to say, liberal democracies are only be able to run with social policies that give people access to medication, food, jobs, and all of those, specifically because they have money, right? Here's the thing. If then we understand that we have resources and there is demand and what we need is more revenue into African states, then we think we're ultimately legitimized to want to be able to form monopolies around these particular resources. Inherently, they belong to us. These people want them, they have to be able to pay for us, right? Cool. There's something that you must also understand, is that structurally, I've said it in my framing, that in terms of industrialization, we have not industrialized to a point where we can be able to sell these things as secondary or tertiary products, right? The problem is, even outside of what they tell from opening in terms of they can be able to go to different states, the problem is sometimes they don't even care. They can buy your primary resources at the highest amount of price because they know they're going to be able to come back to you and be able to sell it to you at an even higher price. So the question becomes, how do we then, what sort of mechanisms can we necessarily buy into that necessarily give us a bargaining power to put them in a very compromised position? Where one, they buy these particular things at higher prices. Where one, we have monopoly and we have total control on these prices and competition. When we necessarily lock them out and leave them with no other options to necessarily come into the particular place. Notice something they say. They say, hey, the problem is opening assumes that the conflict of resources only happens between Western Africans. But the specific thing that they necessarily avoid is that even when they give the example of Rwanda and whosoever fighting for resources, as one who arms those particular individuals and who has the interest in making sure that there is destabilization that necessarily continues to happen there. We think for far too long, African states and how they have necessarily existed have allowed these particular things to necessarily occur. A collective understanding, even if it's in the form of monopoly, it is something that is particularly justified in its entirety.
So far, how is your extension different from an opening government material?
Cool. This is quite simple. One, firstly, we established beyond a reasonable doubt why we are quite fine with the resources running out. What is the principal justification to be able to run with this particular thing? We established why for far too long those resources have not been used for the benefit of South Africa. Quite reasonably, in places like South Africa, the Freedom Charter of the ANC said the resources of South Africa will be used for the benefit of South Africa. Then the question is quite simple. Why hasn't that been done despite the fact that we have a lot of mines and a lot of resources? This is not because we are not selling it right quantities of amount of gold. This is because we are selling that particular gold but at a very low bargain. How then do we secure a significant amount of bargaining power? We think the only way we can be able to do that is for African states to take a stand on their own to say, if this is monopoly in how it stands, we are quite fine with it, and we will run with it. Because for far too long, we have long suffered from all of those things. Cool. So now, for opposition bench, especially chosen to win this entire debate, they have to show us why in terms of especially principal justification, why the monopoly in how it exists is not something that is principally justified. Note, any sort of negative impacts, running of resources, it not being sustainable in the long run, we accept all of those things. At least right now in this particular moment, we will be able to give people fundamental access to the resources that can necessarily be gained from the sales of that particular thing. The problem is we have compromised ourselves when we far too long allowed ourselves to negotiate at the conditions of our oppressors. The only way to run away from those things is to run with mechanisms that are strictly structured to be able to take away from the bargaining power that they necessarily have on us.
Your preferences in the fifth minute have a lot to do, but I'll try to take you the ways. Okay. We're going to start in 3, 2, 1. OG is right when they say closing opposition does not have an alternative and does not have an engagement. They're incredibly disingenuous to this debate. Here is why. When you say all of a sudden the trade agreements will become non-existent because of the particular shift away from this particular the shift away from the trade agreements to the cartels, it becomes disingenuous because the inherent existence of trade agreements is because of the need to begin with. For them to now be non-existent, it will mean that the need now is non-existent as well. It means then it is unclear why, to that premise then, those trade agreements would not be existent when we are using cartels in and of themselves, because the needs are still existent and the demand is still the same. So we can't debate it on that particular metric in and of itself. That's incredibly disingenuous. You can't have that alternative. Secondly, they say this most likely is going to cause retaliation and Western strongholds of states in and of themselves. Firstly, I do not think, number one, the fear of a particular state or the worst is enough of a reason for us to stop ourselves from pursuing economic liberation in and of itself, because that state capture, we do not vouch for that in and of itself. They have to show how then the importance then, the sovereignty is far more better on their side at the point where we can't even have the autonomy to vouch for what economic policies can govern us at a point where we fear other retaliation in and of itself. Note the importance of this argument here. The retaliation that they talk about is most likely not going to be impactful to that particular level, because most likely they're still going to come back because they need the resources to begin with. They say, well, there'll be far more greater exploitation. Two things then. One, exploitation exists on both ends of the side. I don't think you're able to win in that particular regard. The second reason here on the idea of exploitation, I still think we're able to rank above them. Because note, at a point when we're a cartel in this particular matrix, it means we have an incentive to protect the resources that we have in and of themselves, because the meaningful value of the resources is our ability to have them protected and treat them on our own terms. It means most likely that exploitation is now limited in our world because we're measures to protect ourselves and those resources in and of themselves. I don't think you're able to rank closing opposition anyway in this debate, right? Except for fourth, right? Let's look then at what opening opposition say. First, they say we make minerals necessary within Africa for development. We make it the only way, and this is problematic when resources lose value. Three things in this mechanization they give you. One, necessity is bad in this particular regard. We say not really, because resources and minerals are the biggest form of pathway of development and advancement for these African states in and of themselves. So that priority or prioritizing that pursuit isn't necessarily bad, because it is the most proximate form of development that they have anyways. So we think that that form of liberation is justified, whether that necessity you think is bad or not, right? Secondly, they say it is the only form of development. Two things. One, it is not true. It doesn't necessarily mean that advancing and prioritizing a form of development, it means that we're abandoning another one. It doesn't make sense. Secondly, we tell you, even if it is true, state progression in Africa is an urgent issue, so we're justified to pursue this in and of themselves, even if it means that it's the only form of development that we're able to achieve, right? So we're able to show you how, even if it is the only form of development, the ability of us to foster self-actualization and the ability of individuals to be able to advance within society is particularly important, whether it's the only form of development, right? They say resources lose value over time. Two things. One, the minerals being necessary for development does not make it lose value, because the value of minerals in and of themselves is dependent on scarcity and demand of those minerals, right? It's not because we're using them as the only form of necessary form of development, right? Secondly, when we reach the tipping point that they talk about, right? Let's say they lose all the values. At least in our world, we've already established other forms of developmental sectors within our states, because we're able to reap the benefits of us using those particular measures in and of themselves. We still think we're justified, right? Secondly, they say here we have labor is intensive and projects are there's worsening of exploitation and inequality. Again, this exists on both sides. I'm able to show why in our world we have protections against those particular measures and regulations against them, because we want to protect the value and the availability of those minerals to begin with. Lastly, they say the alternatives is that, the alternatives has to be alternatives that don't compromise the sovereignty of states, such as setting prices within the AU. First of all, it is important to note that sovereignty cannot be the chat, because individuals being states compromise the sovereignty all the time for economic benefits in and of themselves, right? We think this is largely important. Secondly, note here, the alternative they talk about of the AU, right, is particularly problematic when they contradict themselves by next saying, oh, well, the AU does not work, this is why the West has to intervene, right? It is uncharitable for you to now say the alternative can be the same AU that you think the West intervenes in and of themselves, right? Let's look at the monopolization of these sectors and why they say it is bad, right? I don't have time, Pax. They say monopolization of these sectors are bad. We say incentives, the incentives are this: innovation and entrepreneurship for the hopes of being particularly better in that particular regard. Why is this true? Because states can't hide individually under the lack of capacity and state capture in and of itself in our world, right? The importance of this is simple. The monopolization becomes better because the way in which you're able to develop and process your particular resources in and of itself is better on our side, because there is a continental level of pressure for you to be held accountable in that particular regard, right? We think we're better in that particular regard, right? Secondly, the sustenance of these monopolies exists on two levels. One, resources and minerals is a global need, and when the need stops, then you can talk about the sustenance. At a point when the need is already existing and still going to exist, we still think we have incentives to keep it running in and of itself. Secondly, here, the lack of sustenance is usually because of lack of capacity and expertise, right? We don't think this is particularly true as well, because the lack of capacity and expertise only exists when countries exist individually. When they exist collectively within Africa, we have that capacity and expertise to maintain and sustain these monopolies to begin with. Lastly, this is when unable to control the resources, right? They don't say we have control of those resources because exploitation is worse on their side, and we protect it and not protect exploitation, we protect our resources from that exploitation in the particular regard. With that, we are able to rank present government against any other team. Here.
We thank the governor for his speech. We now have to vote on opposition vote in the case as well as this case. Here.
Okay. If I speak at this level, is that audible for you? Alright. So I'll just do my best to take 2 POIs from you guys. So please have them, do not barge up.
Okay, I want to start the speech in 3, 2, 1, go. I want to highlight at the top of this speech the 2 reasons why we beat our opening. First, we provide better mechanisms for why status quo can build negotiating power against the West. This is where OIC explains to you about political will and how these countries have political will, and that political will can transition into you having much better bilateral agreements. The second reason why we win this debate is that in terms of harms, we identify much larger harms. OO identifies that countries are more vulnerable and will economically have these difficulties. We explain structurally why you get civil wars, why you get genocides, why you get conflicts, why you get instability in a lot of these countries. And I want to get to a lot of these other things. I want to start with OG and have a couple of responses. OG says you're much more likely going to have Dutch disease. They never even respond to this. Because if Dutch disease is that you're transporting more raw materials than you're growing, they never prove to us how you create processing materials in your country and able to process those goods. So at best it's symmetric. You can't give them the debate on that. But secondly, they say that, oh, they are bad prices. And so if I go to Oyisa, I charge him a different price, I go to this person. I want to mitigate this totally. Note, in capitalism and open markets, that's just what happens. I price discriminate. I go to one person, I tell them I have this amount. I go to one person, I tell them I have this amount. It's a market thing. So it is unrealistic. There is no specific harm because we do it in markets when people price discriminate. So when a person who has more money comes, I sell it to them at $100. The person who has less money, I sell to them at $20. It's unclear why this make is very important and it mitigates a lot of their impact. But second thing is, I want to note that the problem on their side, and this is the problem, PM identifies this in his speech, that, oh, you have these people directly infiltrating us. Panel, you can Google the manual right now, and judges are allowed to check the internet. I want to note that they don't have fiat to explain the type of response that someone is going to give. OISA gives you the likelihood analysis where you are much more likely going to have an aggressive response. Tell that to Venezuela right now, whose president is on the watch list, who they are trying to actively attack. Tell that to DRC Congo, who Patrice Lumumba was killed because he was trying to galvanize those resources against them. They need to go against all that historical analysis that OISA gives you and explains. The second thing is, they talk about, like, they give this, and to be fair, they try to model. They try to model how you have regulations and infrastructure. A couple of responses. Sustainability. OISA explains to you why you don't even need to attack all these people. You need to attack one player, and that player starts to want more money. And this is what he gives you when he tells you about Congo. So note, on their side, the problem is that you are likely going to make this sustainable because countries are going to get civilized. But also, panel, I think this presumes stability in the long run for all these countries, which is just unrealistic. There is no make to explain to us why you're likely going to have stability in those countries to make this happen. Lastly, on monopoly, 3 responses here. 1, PM says that there is high demand and high supply. He had to explain to us why if I don't buy from African countries, I'm not going to go and buy to Australia. Not that markets work like that. If I can't buy from you, I go to the next person. The only make you get from OG is that these minerals are critical. Critical doesn't mean that I can't buy them from somewhere else. Critical doesn't mean that I can't come to your countries and have aggressive interventions. For example, the RSF in Darfur, who are actively now disenfranchising a lot of people and taking that gold to the UAE. It is unclear. They needed to give us those makes to explain why that is going to happen on their side. But lastly, they have this argument about, oh, you're much more likely going to have influence and lobbying power. I want to note that even if it is symmetric, that to some extent you get imperialism on both sides of the world, it is far much worse on their side. Why? Because it's an all-out aggression onto you. Imagine, for example, countries where big players like the West literally were trying to orchestrate regime changes. Note, on their side, you don't just get your minerals taken away. You get a regime change which is bad. Tell that to Chile, who was taken and Pinochet had to help them, and Pinochet subjected them to a lot of slavery. Tell that to Venezuela, who actively suffered before they had a socialist government. This is important to say that on their side of the world, the response is not just economically aggressive, it is politically aggressive. It's politically aggressive and that is harmful, not just for economics, but also for the politics of the country. But to DPM says that, oh, you have comparative advantage. And I want to be clear here, panel. Note, the precondition to trade is not just having the resource, it's having the political will and the leverage to switch that person. They don't give mechanisms while you have that political leverage, while you have that political will to be able to do that. Lastly, they say that you're much more likely going to have sustainability. And I want to be fair to DPM, because DPM analyzes this in terms of cartels and how the cartels are going to be able to do well and the countries. But not, DPM shoots herself in the foot when she considers that corruption also exists. Because even if I make money from resources, you have to guarantee us why those resources are going to get allocated. They make it seem like it's intuitive that when you make money, you not put it this side and this side. It's not, it's just unclear, the POI.
Yeah, first of all, political will is not mutually exclusive to your side. But even if it is true that all these actors are going to now not act subtly as they are doing now and ignore international law and election cycles in their own democracies and active call out, how then do you solve that in your world?
Dude, Oyisa literally explains to you why the political will on our side is much better, because it's within the internally of the country. Your political will depends on galvanizing everyone else's political will. Our comparative only depends on the single political will of that country. You really can't win the debate. What will these responses show you about OG? One, we mitigate their best case impact on Dutch disease and on bad pricing. But secondly, we totally negate their impact on sustainability because we explain to you why you don't get that sustainability. Lastly, we flip their neck on how you create problems because we say their side on the cartel creates backlash. Backlash which harms minorities. Backlash which is harming the people in RSF in Sudan, who the UAE, a supplier, is actually funding there to control the genocide. And I think lastly, I just want to get to CG here, a couple of very quick responses. CG says, oh, you're going to benefit. CG had to prove why you're much more likely going to sell the thing, right? Like you can create the cartel, but you have to prove that you're going to sell it. We explain to you why buyers are much more likely going to leave. CG says, oh, you can sell it to them at a higher price. Even if you sell them to a higher price, they will never buy it from you because the cost of production becomes higher. Second response, on their side of the world, it is just unclear because even if you sell it at a high cost, they sell those goods back to you at a higher cost and you can't afford them because a lot of your masses don't have those subsidies to benefit themselves. So their world is bad. Lastly, exploitation. I want to argue, even if exploitation is symmetric, on our side, we're losing out just on the price. On their side, they're losing out on price, they're losing out on lives, they're losing out on political will because you actively attack our countries and you actively attack our economies. State progression. State progression is dependent on you having stability. If stability is hampered because of political infiltration by other countries, that is a far, far much harmful side. When I end this debate, I want to conclude. Why do we win? One, we just have better mechanisms to explain to you why this is going to fail. But most importantly, sustainability. They have fear, but they can't prove the response. The response is harmful. Pick CEO.